is Focus with Jack Cottle.
And good evening, I'm Jack Cottle. Welcome to this month's edition of Focus. This month we're talking about sexual assault, sexual harassment, domestic violence. Three guests with us to talk about that. Darla Black is the Vice President of the Oglala Sioux Tribe. She is also a domestic violence survivor. Linda Schroll, the Executive Director of Programs for Working Against Violence Incorporated. And Mark Vargo is the Pennington County State's Attorney. A few statistics as we talk about that. Sexual assault and sexual harassment being talked about a lot these days, possibly more than they ever have before. That all started with the Harvey Weinstein incident. Has people talking about that all across the country. Nationally, statistics from the CDC say nearly 1 in 5 women, nearly 1 in 171 men experience rape at some point in their lives. Department of Justice says 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men sexually abused at some point in their lives. Mark Varga, we're going to start with you when we talk about sexual assault, domestic violence. From a legal perspective, what are those?
When we move from sexual harassment into sexual assault, what we're really talking about is force and violence. All of what these things have in common is a cycle of power and control. So domestic violence, sexual harassment, sexual assault are all three related in the sense that they all involve the power and control that the perpetrator has over the person, the victim. And the levels or the distinctions that we draw between them, obviously domestic violence can take almost any form. Sexual harassment is sexual in nature, but does not necessarily involve force and violence. And then when you move into an unconsented act that is backed by force and violence, that's when we're dealing with sexual assault.
Now you guys prosecute all sorts of crimes. How big of a portion of your guys' work are these types of crimes?
They're some of the most serious ones that we do, and they're also some of the most difficult ones. As you can imagine, the Me Too campaign made it very clear that it is very difficult to talk about these things. The victims of this violence do not necessarily come forward for all of the reasons that make them vulnerable in the first place. These perpetrators are not necessarily bright men, but they tend to be very good at picking victims, particularly when we're talking about sexual harassment and sexual assault. They try to pick people that they know will not be able to reach a platform where they can speak up. And so those are hard cases to investigate, hard cases to prove down the road. I am very proud of the work that we've done in this community, both our law enforcement and our partners like Wavy, in terms of giving women a safe platform from which to speak, which ultimately I think is the one area that we can really make a dent in this. Because I don't think until you have that spot from which you can speak that we'll ever see the problem go away.
Now, Linda Schroll, you're down at Wavy. You are dealing with victims day in, day out. In an ideal world, Wavy would not have to exist, but obviously it does. As you look at those crimes, sexual assault and domestic violence, what comes to your mind when you hear those?
First of all, it happens to everybody, not everybody, but anybody. It crosses all lines. And what we see a lot is sexual violence occurring in domestic violence situations. So if you look at our numbers, it will show that we serve a lot more domestic violence victims than we do sexual assault victims, but that's only because they count what their first victimization is, what they come in first for, and because sexual assault is so hard to talk about, they're going to talk about the domestic violence first. But what we see is we have found that almost all the time, 95% of the time of the victims we serve, sexual assault is part of another wheel that they're using in the domestic violence for power and control. They're using that sexual assault as another way to control. It's happening in domestic violence situations all the time.
Now, Darla, you describe yourself as a domestic violence survivor. How much of your story are you comfortable sharing with us?
Well, I'm comfortable sharing with a little bit from the beginning. From when the violence started happening. And the reason why I'm comfortable with it today is because it took a lot of healing for me over the years in order to get to where I am today. When I was young, I met a man, and I thought, that he was going to be the father of my children, and that, we'd have a nice home, anything that a woman would dream of. And it was okay in the beginning. It was nice in the beginning. Midway through, the alcoholism started. And I would stay home with my children, take care of my children. I have a daughter and 3 sons, and he would come home 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. The assaults began, physical, mental, sexual, emotional, and it continued and continued and continued until one January night. And he came home, and I and my children were in bed, and he came and he started yelling around, and I saw my daughter get up, and then the assault, physical assaults started happening. And the next thing you know, I was drug out of bed, drug into the other room, and he started kicking me all over the place in my facial area. And I could see a bone protruding from my nose here, and there was blood squirting out. And I looked, and I saw my daughter standing there, and she couldn't cry, She just stood there, and she was breathing hard. And from there, I walked out. I told him I want to leave, and his father came out and said, let her go. So I took my jacket, put it on. I put the jackets on my kids and the shoes, and we were going to leave. It was blizzarding outside, but I had enough. I made up my mind, and I had been planning it, but I didn't know when to leave because I didn't have a job. I didn't have nowhere to go, and I didn't know what to do. I didn't have nothing. And so, but on that night, I remember it was time to go. Enough is enough. And so I took my kids. I had my boys on this side and my daughter on this side. And we were going to go out the door, and he said, you can't go. Take that jacket off, take the shoes off, then you can go. So I took my jacket off, took my shoes off, and I left them. I didn't care. It didn't matter to me. I just wanted out. And we started walking down the road. I was barefooted, didn't have a jacket, but I was carrying my children. And my daughter said, he's coming, Mom. And I told her, well, if anything happens, I'm going to throw you this way. Keep going and don't look back, and I will come find you. And at that time, I seriously thought I was going to die. I prayed, and I told the Great Spirit that, if I was going to die tonight, to, my kids. I was thinking about my kids. And just then the car pulled up here. And here it was his brother, and he said, hurry up and come. He's coming with an iron bar. So I opened the door, and I threw the kids in the car. And just as we were leaving, the iron bar broke the back of the windshield, or the back window of the vehicle. And as we were driving away, I seriously thought I was going to die that night. And when they took me to my adopted sisters here in Rapid City, I felt this low. My face was a mess, scars all over my face. I mean, these were wide open cuts, and I really didn't feel like living. I didn't know. I didn't feel good about myself. I felt worthless. Didn't know what to do. But what I knew was my kids. Nobody would take my kids, and if I died, he would get the kids. And that stayed in the back of my mind. And, my adopted sister, Beverly, she kind of nursed me back to health, and she started talking to me, and I realized then that I needed some help, I needed someone to talk to, I needed help. And I'm really grateful because I did get the help. And when I met the ladies here, I laughed because it's like taboo for Native Americans to talk to, somebody in behavioral health. And when I met, the person that I was talking to, later I realized that I did all the talking. And the therapy, it was me doing all the talking. And I realized that I had my own answers the entire time. I started focusing on myself. I went back to my grandmother, and my grandmother told me to go back. And I told her, you know, I listened to you a lot, but this time I can't listen to you. And looking at the scars on my face, and then I met the medicine man. She said, it's time for you to go and see the medicine man, and she told me what to do. So I went there. And the teachings that I received from there was, you know, your body is a medicine wheel. You have spiritual, mental, physical, and emotional. And, you know, in our language, he told us that we have to heal all these components in order to feel good about yourself. And I focused on that. And for 10 years, I stayed alone, just focused on my kids and my own healing. And when I went back to the ceremony, I could feel myself getting stronger and stronger and stronger. And every now and then a memory would come back and I'd slip back and then keep moving forward. Then I started reading self-help books, and I started talking to people a lot, you know, a lot of our people. And they always say talking circles and stuff like that, but for the longest time, I couldn't talk about what happened to me, what I experienced. And today it's still, you know, I get a little emotional with thinking about the memory and all that stuff, because we put it behind, you know, once you follow through this healing. But today, you know, I'm grateful to be here. I'm grateful to be here on camera to share my story, because I know at home, I'm from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, that there's a lot of women that go through that. And I want them to know that there is help, you know, with my sister here that I met. There is help. And so what I did was I focused on myself. And my grandmother said, education is the key. You have to educate yourself in order to get something done in your life. And that stuck in my head. And she said, you're going to dig us out of poverty, you know. And that stuck in my head. So I went into the United States Army National Guard. And when I finished there, I went home. And I became a law enforcement officer at the age of 23. I became a police officer with the Wounded Knee District of Manderson. And from there, I was transferred in as a sergeant using the military. And then I went into a lieutenant position. And then I went into criminal investigations. I went to Glencoe, Georgia, and I spent 3 months down there going to school to be a criminal investigator.
I hate to interrupt. We got to take a break. We'll continue that discussion when we come back with this month's edition of Focus.
Okay.
I'm Jack Cottle. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus. We are talking about sexual assault, sexual harassment, and domestic violence. Linda Schroll is the Executive Director of Programs against Working Against Violence Incorporated here in Rapid City. These are some of the most unreported crimes in the country. Why is it so difficult for people to step forward and speak out and get this dealt with?
Well, if you think of your most horrible thing that's ever happened to you, and then you think of even just something like your worst date, which would be your worst date, and then couple that with the worst thing that's ever happened to you, and then you're going to go and tell somebody that you don't know. How comfortable would you be relating that information? And then not only that, but you look at most of the people that we work with, that we see, the victims coming forward or the survivors coming forward, they have so much shaming going on, like, oh, if I shouldn't have done this, or I could have done this, or why didn't I do this, that they're second guessing themselves. And then you look at society and you look at what we see, the messages that we see, and you know, oh, you shouldn't have been out drinking, or you shouldn't have been out doing this, whatever it is. And even though that has nothing to do with what happened to them, it still is internalized. And so it's really difficult. It's really difficult to come out and tell about something so personal that has happened to you.
Now, Darla Black is the Vice President of the Oglala Sioux Tribe. You finally spoke out. What made it so difficult that made you take that long to be able to do that?
I guess the healing process and the scars you have scars on your face and you're really self-conscious about those scars, you know, and sometimes somebody will bring it to your attention. Oh, well, what happened to you and what happened to your face? You know, why do you have those scars? And sometimes I say something, sometimes I don't. But after being in law enforcement for 27 years, working as a criminal investigator, investigating people with domestic violence crimes, victims, and working with children and seeing some of the things happen to them that were similar to what happened to me, it's like I grew thicker skin to it, you know, and I felt like being in law enforcement, I felt like I wanted to do something. I had to do something to give back to the people because I survived. I lived. You know, I lived. And I don't like being referred to as a victim now because if you look at my career, I stood back up. But it took a long time to get there. I stood back up with law enforcement, and even in the position as vice president today, I'm a leader, but I'm also a leader through prayer too, spiritual. During that time, I picked up that spirituality, and I still live it today. Every single day, I have 5 self-help books that I read that have to do with my self-esteem, have to do with different, even talks about loving, you know, how to love once again. So the healing never ended. I still practice it every single day. I get up early, I read these books, I say prayers. I still practice my ceremonies that I started back then. I'm still doing the same thing that I started. And it has to, because sometimes if I start thinking about it, then I could feel myself going backward a little. And so in order to heal, it's an everyday process. And that's why I agreed to come on camera, because I know my people at home, there's a lot of young girls that are going through the same thing that I'm going through, and probably here in Rapid City. You know, they're going through the same thing. But if you have faith, if you have that medicine wheel concept with your body, you have that spiritual, you dealt with your mental, you dealt with your emotional, and you've dealt with your physical. And what I always tell people when they come to me is, all you have is a prayer. Because when I walked out that day, all I had was a prayer.
Mark Vargo, Pennington County State's Attorney. From a prosecution standpoint, how difficult is it to get these victims to come forward, be willing to stand up in court and do that? How big of a challenge is that?
It all depends on the support network that's around them. Because what Vice President Black said is a very powerful story of what happened to her and how she got past it. But you notice that it wasn't just about what she did, but the people that she was able to surround herself with. Her stepsister, her grandmother, a counselor, a medicine man. And so we are always looking both in the community and specifically, again, with partners like Wavy or our partners on the tribe, we're always looking for those people that will be that person for a victim, to give them the support that they need so that they can stand up and speak the truth about what happened to them. And that's what's important to us, so that's the role that we fill. We have to understand and we have to learn to walk alongside them and wait for them when they're ready. That's one of the things that law enforcement has gotten very good at. It used to be that if the victim wouldn't give you the story, the moment you showed up at the house, then just pack up and everybody go home. We know better now. We know that it's a process of revelation, and it is power and control. And if you've exercised power and control over another human being, possibly for years, we don't break that cycle in half an hour because a cop car showed up out front. So that's what we have to kind of understand. That's what we work with.
All right, we got to take another break. We'll continue with this month's edition of Focus right after this. Good evening, I'm Jack Cotto. Welcome back to this month's edition of Focus, talking about sexual assault, domestic violence, sexual harassment. Darla Black is the vice president of the Oglala Sioux tribe. Darla, CDC statistics say that percentages of rape are the group's highest in the country. Native American and Alaskan Natives, are you seeing those same trends down on the Pine Ridge Reservation?
Yes, and a lot of it is actually unreported. You know, a lot of them come forward, they'll tell certain people, but when it comes to actually doing something, it is difficult, and a lot of them, there's no follow-through. One of the projects that I involve myself in is the missing and murdered women across Canada and the United States. because I feel like that's a form of domestic violence as well. It's a different, now it's human trafficking, but I can relate. I can relate to that. So I'm actually following those and involving myself in that on the Pine Ridge as well. But yes, we do. We have a lot of young people that are still being assaulted.
Mark Vargo, Pennington County State's Attorney. FBI stats always list South Dakota is one of the top few states in the country when it comes to rape statistics. Do we know, are there more happening here? Do more people report it here? Do we prosecute more here? Do we know?
We really don't. Breaking it down would be very difficult. What I would say is that I do believe, having prosecuted in this town for 25 years, we have made huge inroads into law enforcement investigations, both our tribal partners and here in Rapid City, and in prosecution. I think that encourages people to come forward, and I am hopeful that that means that we are getting a better percentage of reporting than perhaps you see elsewhere. But as far as being able to tell, how do you quantify something that's invisible?
Right.
Linda Schroll is the Executive Director of Programs at Working Against Violence Incorporated. Do you feel like we're making progress in this fight?
I do. I think we're seeing increased numbers, but that means more people are feeling comfortable or are feeling more comfortable to coming out and to saying something, to speaking out, to telling their story. So where our numbers are increasing, I think that is a good thing in showing that they are more willing to come out. So where more stuff was kept underneath the surface, they're feeling more comfortable, victims are, about coming out and talking. And I think this right here, the education, the being able to work together, the more that our community works together and that we see across the board that we're supporting each other and we're supporting victims, the more likely they are to continue to come forward.
Are you encouraged when you see something like the Me Too campaign that's going on right now, where you have people that have been holding this back for 10 years, 20 years, however long, and now they're speaking out and say, here's what happened?
Absolutely. Anytime a victim can move from victim to survivor to victor, like my friend Darla here, that's an amazing thing. And so that's always what we're striving for.
What advice would you give somebody that's holding this inside that needs to speak out? What advice would you give to them?
Well, it took a while for me to leave. I wanted to leave, my mind wanted to leave, but actually physically walking out the door was difficult. So my recommendation today would be just do it. Just leave. Just leave, because there's help now out here. There is help. And also talk about it. You know, it took me 10 years to realize that it's okay to talk about it. And once I talked about it, it was like a release, like I let something go, like something, and it felt like that. It was really beautiful when I finally came out and talked about it, kept talking about it, cried, you know. So that would be my advice. You know, there's help out here. Just leave. It's okay to leave. It's okay to leave.
We got about 30 seconds left. Linda, if somebody needs help, how do they reach out to you? 341-3292. Come to the door, 527 Quincy. We're always open 24 hours a day. And Mark, plenty of legal remedies, legal ways to go as well?
We help anyone we can. If we don't have a criminal charge, we'll very often hook them up with resources in the community. There are people there to help.
All right. Again, Darla Black, Linda Schroll, and Mark Varga, I want to thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you again the first Sunday night of next month on Focus.